Good morning, class. We are about to get started with another lecture. This week we're going to be looking at human development, kind of like an overview, because we'll be covering some stages of development, like adolescence and puberty, much later in the semester. But so today we're kind of going to do a very, very rough sort of piecemeal overview of kind of like the general development of human, of our lifespan. Looking a little bit more specifically at infant development. But before we do that, just a general announcement that everyone needs to make sure that we are, and I'll keep saying this every week, make sure that we are doing our assignments and make sure that we are doing our discussion boards and make sure we are doing our quizzes on a weekly basis. Usually the assignment stuff is something that's just building upon the lecture that we're having, as well as the discussion board. And then the quiz is a way of us kind of recapitulating the salient points of the prior week. So you want to make sure that you are spending time doing those. You want to make sure that you are taking the time to get that done. It has always been a thing where some people, just in the slowness of getting on to an online class, are not getting these first few weeks done, and then they realize, come midterm, which is going to be only a few weeks away, that they haven't gotten any real work done in the class, and now they're looking at a failing grade going into midterms, and that's frustrating for them and for me too. So. As well as the quizzes and the assignments are the type of things that I actually pull the questions from for our midterm. So you'll see a certain amount of regurgitation when it comes to your examination. And you guys are preparing yourselves for the midterm when you sit down and you do these assignments. So just make sure that we're starting to get on top of that. I don't think our participation last week in the sort of graded portion of our course so far was quite as thorough as I would have liked. So other than that, I want to spend a little bit of time reviewing what we've covered so far, just because it's going to be important for us. When we're thinking about this bigger question of psychology, we have this impetus. Why are we studying the human psyche? Why are we spending so much time? And I think from our first week we came up with a very interesting kind of rationale for the purpose of psychology, and that was to understand, to predict, and to control. And when we talk about what is the goal of psychology, I believe that's how we framed it in the first week. The goal of psychology was first to understand human behavior, to be able to not only kind of break the veil of why we do what we do, but then to also be able to iterate that, to put that into terms that other people can understand, to create a sort of normalization for the varied aspects of human behavior, because we all do very different things. Even when it may look completely different, we might be doing it for the same sort of reason. And so a psychologist is starting to create a language that normalizes differing behavior in such a way that we can actually talk about it and discuss it. And that's part of the understanding of the human psyche. Very, very important thing, because if we don't have this sort of collective language, and this is something that kind of comes up today as well, if we don't have a collective language, then how can we, start to identify our behaviors with other people's behaviors? And how can we start to make sense of things on a collective and communal scale? But once we can understand human behavior, we can start to predict it. And when we're predicting behavior, that means we're starting to understand the triggers and the stressors that go into certain actions. Like, say that we had this sort of behavior that maybe we overeat. Well, you can through studying that sort of thing, start to understand and predict what's going to cause an individual to, let's say, go overeat, and he wants to stop that sort of behavior. Well, psychology will give us the tools necessary to start to understand that sort of behavior and then predict, oh, well, if these are the sort of situations that he's putting himself in or she's putting themselves in, then that's going to generate this desire to respond through overeating. And then ultimately takes us to the final step, which is control. We can actually change the conditions of the conversation, change the conditions of stressors, of triggers, in order to improve behavior, provide a more balanced and holistic life. And that's ultimately the goal here. It's not necessarily this like Machiavellian control where we're trying to manipulate other people, but no, it's the goal of psychology is to get people to understand why they're behaving the way they behave, identify the way they want to behave, and start to push people towards that more positive, holistic approach towards life. So that was a very important part of our first week. From last week, we talked about the brain. We talked a little bit. It was more of a anatomical discussion about what's going on inside of our body. Some of the more important things that we want to remember from that. First of all, is this concept of neuroplasticity. Under the catchphrase, if you don't use it, you lose it. When we're talking about what does it mean to possess neuroplasticity, it's this idea that the brain is constantly working and reworking itself to operate as efficiently as possible. And so when we're talking about memories, when we're talking about knowledge, when we're talking about skill sets, if you basically signal towards your body, towards your mind, that you're not going to use these sorts of things, it actually starts to overwrite that information. And the way we do that is through not using it. And think of it like, if you've ever learned a second language, and then you go, years and years and years without any sort of practice, that piece by piece, bit by bit, you will start to lose fluency. You will start to lose something that had literally rewired your brain. Learning a second language does that. But if you don't keep that up, the brain itself starts to undo all that work. It is plastic. It is moldable. And so when we talk about the sort of neuroplasticity of the brain, what we're talking about is this very important concept that your brain develops to its usage. The brain develops to its usage. And so when we use it more or use it less, depending on the sort of strains and activities and mental things that we do, we are either in some ways helping the brain, in other ways could even be like allowing it to atrophy and decay. The other things that we talked about last week that are of particular importance. We talked about the different temporal lobes, occipital lobe, etc., etc. The dual hemispheres of the brain, the corpus callosum, that sort of interfibrous network that connects those hemispheres, the cerebellum, medulla oblongata, the amygdala, all these different things. And while some of them are completely, obviously, irreplaceable, like you lose your medulla oblongata, you no longer have the ability to regulate heart, so there's not much of a you at that point without a heartbeat. But ultimately, even though the brain is made up of many different parts, these parts are always interworking, and in this sort of neuroplasticity, reworking themselves in order to function. And so even as the brain can be I just don't want us to walk away saying that it's just this sort of like computer parts where if you pull out one piece, the whole thing fails. That certainly can be the case, depending on the part of the brain. But the brain has a lot more flexibility than we ever thought possible. And the sort of like austere cases like Zebulon Pike, where this dude gets a rail spike shoved through his head, and yet he still functions, yet he's still alive, even though he had like a frontal lobe lobotomy. kind of demonstrates this sort of yes, we are the sum total of the different parts of the brain, but the functioning of the brain is more than just the bricolage of assembled pieces. And the last thing to review, and this mainly comes from the book because I don't think we actually had that much time in the lecture to cover it, but is the influence of hormones on top of this sort of neurology that we have. We have a neurochemistry, and not only is it just like electrical stimulation that goes through the conduction of nerves, but we also have this level of hormonal chemistry that's taking place in the brain between serotonin and dopamine and the regulation through the pituitary gland. And so much of our moods and the way we work at a neurological level is being generated not only by the bits and pieces of the brain, but by the sorts of hormones that affect us as well. So we have multiple things going on in the production and development of the material side of our mind. That was an important concept to think about last week, that we were parsing out, what is cognitive, what is material. And this week, as we're looking at kind of human development, we're turning away from that, but we should also keep this in mind very much, that as we develop, we're developing not only cognitively, but materially as well. Our minds are growing as our personhood is growing. So with that in mind, we can move forward a little bit too. I guess it's fitting when we're talking about the materiality of an individual. When we think about our earliest beginnings as a person, we know that as we are created as a zygote, which is, sperm meets egg, and they hang out. And next thing you know, you have this single cell organism that will, over the course of the next 36 weeks, develop into a full-fledged human. At the basis of that person is our own genetic code that comes half from our one parent, half from the other parent. Hopefully we don't need to explain in detail the way all that genetic mapping takes place, and meiosis, and the procedure in which we have this sort of random recombination of traits and features, and why some kids look different than other kids, and but we're made up of this deoxyribonucleic acid, this DNA. These are the building blocks of who we are. These chromosomal pairs that code basically everything about us. And it's something that when it comes to our DNA, that at one point that seemed like this sort of black box, this sort of impenetrable structure that we are made up of DNA, and we can understand a little bit about what goes wrong and what goes right, and where the Y gene comes in for males, and certain severe deformities that take place at a chromosomal level. But also in the when was it? I know I was in high school back then, so early 2000s is when they started to really do the DNA project, and they were mapping out every single thing. I think it was called the Human Genome Project, actually, where they were mapping out where on each chromosome, where in each bit of DNA does our information for hair, eye color, skin color, etc., etc., etc. come from. And so, this black box has been penetrated. And today, when we think about our DNA, when we think about what makes us who we are, that question has just become more and more complicated as we have penetrated that black box. Case in point, when we think about, for those of you that are criminal justice people, there's been made cases that we can look into a person's DNA to examine the sort of triggers they have to, they basically, there's been made this legal cases in the past that people with this sort of chromosomal configuration will have a much harder time controlling outbursts from controlling anger. And so, when they respond violently or negatively in aggressive situations, I think this is called like the warrior gene. When they respond violently or aggressively in situations, this is not their fault. This is the fault of the chromosomes. This is their DNA. This is their hard mapping, coding them, telling them who to be and what to be. And so, how can they control that? And so, as we've started to understand, and that's up for you to buy into or not buy into. Just because, there's plenty of people that would possess that sort of like aggressive gene that doesn't go out and respond violently in all situations. But point being is we continually understand more fully our genetic makeup. It's not making things necessarily easier. In some ways it is, but it's also making things more complicated. And that we have this sort of like real material detailed understanding of, this predicts that sort of behavior. But on top of our DNA, we also have environmental influences. When we think about like the production of children, our environment is anything outside of that sort of like internal DNA structure that affects the way a person is. One of the simplest and easiest ways to talk about environmental factors of infants is going to be something like alcohol and tobacco. We see all these warnings that come on cigarettes and come on alcohol. If you're drinking this can cause fetal alcohol syndrome. These are environmental factors that affect a baby before it's born. And so these sorts of environmental triggers can have profound effects on what's taking place in the baby. But these environmental things will also go forward and affect a child, not necessarily just tobacco and alcohol, but the way you interact with your environment will affect you past birth. It's no exaggeration to say that there will be a wildly different person. Like if you have twins and separated, and one of them you put in a sterile white room, and the only interaction they have is feeding, there will be a wildly different developmental process between that child and the one who's raised in, like, a twin who's raised in the exact same, or in a perfectly full, normal, nurturing environment where they're getting constant stimulation, constant attention, and being taken care of. The one that grows up in a true, full environment will not only develop faster, mature faster, but the one who doesn't will be extremely retarded in their growth, stunted in their sort of personal, cognitive, motor skills across the board. These things are reliant upon the sort of environment that we grow up in. So they affect us very, very much in our ability to learn and develop as a person. So as an infant, and that's partly because, as I say here, the infant has fewer synaptic connections, which is basically a synaptic connection is a memory, a thought. It's basically a point of contact between two nodes of information. So it's less established, but the brain has what we call, for an infant, much greater plasticity. So in these early stages, the child's mind is learning and developing and growing at a much more rapid rate than we do as adults, and that carries with it a sort of double-edged sword. You will never be able to assimilate and integrate information quite as uniquely and well as you do when you are a kid. And you gotta think that's because so much of this is just coming from the all the observations that you take in as a small kid, not from sitting down and learning book knowledge. When talking about this sort of book knowledge,
I remember one of my professors in school told me the story of when he was working on this sort of like AI, basically an artificial intelligence program, and they weren't trying to develop like a sort of adult AI, but instead just trying to generate an AI that was driven by that was being driven by the sort of knowledge that a toddler might have. And he found it to actually be like a much, much more difficult program than anything that they had thought possible in their original musings. And that's because of the just overwhelming weight of knowledge that a child starts to develop. And when we think of all the stuff that we know, one of the things we wanna jump to immediately is like book knowledge and learning, the type of stuff that's pretty easy to assemble, um, just from like a Wikipedia or Google search. When you think about all the stuff we know, well, I'm well versed in German history or American literature or chemical reactions or the criminal justice code. This is the type of stuff that's knowledge that we define ourselves by because it's maybe something that other people don't know, but it's the sort of like large-scale human interactions, the sort of everyday knowledge that encompasses so much of what we know. Things like, with you go to a 4-year-old, if you ask them, what goes on top, peanut butter or jelly, the jelly goes on top. How do you know that? Well, you just know. When you're making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, the peanut butter's on bottom, the jelly's on top. You put it down. So if you're making peanut butter and banana sandwich, peanut butter's on bottom, the banana's on top. This is known. This is what we do. But there's nothing that necessarily teaches us that. We don't go to school and read a book on how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. We just have this sort of intuitive knowledge. It's not really intuition. What it is in this early stage of human development, the brain is taking in everything, assimilating everything, adjusting to everything. And by doing so, it's learning much, much more than just our book knowledge. What it's learning is what does it mean to be a human? And that's the sort of like intellectual expanse that is so much more difficult when we think about what makes an artificial intelligence or machine actual intelligence. That's what's kind of missing. Is this the millions of things that you have to know in order to know what it means to be a human. And it's the type of stuff you don't necessarily go to school for. It's the type of stuff that you only learn through observation and interaction, assimilation and adaptation. Which is kind of, like I said, it's very different. It's a different set of knowledge from the type of things that you might study. You can go and you can say, I can memorize recipes, but we're talking about the stuff that you don't memorize, the type of stuff that's insouciant, that's just kind of part of us, that's fundamental to our being and creates a very natural part of who we are and how we become who we are. These are all sorts of things that in this early stage of life, when this neuroplasticity is so high, that we start to develop. So when we're thinking about, and we're going to talk a little bit about Piaget's theory of development and a couple other Erik Erikson's later, but when we're thinking about the just sort of general stages of infant development, we start out as helpless creatures, and the thing that's kind of unique about, not 100% unique, but pretty unique about humans is how helpless we really are. When you compare them to other animals within the animal kingdom, you might think about a deer. A deer is born, and within minutes it has to be able to walk. Within minutes it has to be able to move to get away from predators. And that's the sort of difference between humans and almost any other creature. We had this like insanely long developmental period where we can't do anything. The baby can't even hold its head up. So We have to be able to hold up the baby's head because the baby can't do it itself. But we start in this world essentially helpless. We are fully reliant upon our parents or caregivers to take care of us. But past that, one of the first things that we start to develop is this sort of motor development. And one of the things that's kind of interesting is that you can look at our book for the different stages of motor development, but they develop pretty much across the board at a sort of like regular rate. Between, when do you start to lift your head up? When can you lift your body up? When do you start to crawl? When do you start to waddle? When can you actually walk? When can you grab things? And these sorts of developments, so often we want to, new parents want to boast, and these are very boast-worthy things because they're milestones for you as a parent. But these are also completely ununique things in that kids are going through the same process at the same time point. But there's always that one parent out there who wants to say, well, my kid's he's walking earlier than everyone else, faster than everyone else, and generally speaking, that's oftentimes not the case. But it's what parents do. But outside of the motor functions, we also have this sort of development of external sensitivity, which is our reactions and responses to the external world, which is where we are starting to pick up on sounds, starting to pick up on sights, starting to pick up on smells. And for anyone who's been around a kid, we can see them interacting with their environment at a very, very cognizant level. They are in many ways fascinated with the environment because they're learning all these new things, and their brain is starting to assimilate and adapt to this complicated world that has gone from inside a womb to now they're living, basically developing with sights and sounds and smells and light and darkness and needs and hunger and all this other stuff. But we're also developing at the same time the sort of internal sensitivity, which is where the kid is starting to basically recognize their own existence. And there's tons and tons and tons of psychology that takes place at these sorts of early levels, where they're talking about Lacan and his mirror stage, which is the age where a baby is able to look at a mirror and recognize this is me. And he actually talks about how there's this like fundamental disconnect that up until that stage there's this sort of anxiety where a kid will look into a mirror and recognize as someone else. And so we have this break in personhood that takes place because of the misassignation or the misidentification of the figure in the mirror. And so, like, when we're talking about, there's been basically the point what I'm saying is that we've had tons and tons and tons of ink spilled over, how do we develop these sort of internal sensitivities. I put here Fort Da, which is another Freudian example of where the kid starts to develop this recognition. This is an observation that Freud made while looking at his little nephew and his mother throwing a ball, or him throwing a ball and the mother bringing it back. And the kid is experiencing loss every time that the ball is thrown, but then this experience of joy whenever the ball is brought back. And so this like cycle of trauma is being repeated as the ball goes and comes and goes and comes, and it's setting up these initial interactions with loss. And these are kind of like archetypical examples of where psychologists start to draw very large conclusions over very minute observations. But it's also being done because we've seen the influence that everything has on a child's young mind. One of the most important things when it comes to development is this: are we in a nurturing environment or a depriving environment? And deprivation becomes a thing where, if we have a sort of depriving environment, the acute effects that might have on an infant. So when we start to ever talk about Lacan and we talk about Freud, especially when we're looking at their sort of infant, their theories on infant development, sometimes they may say, oh, this is, look at this little game of tossing a ball and look at the huge psychological implications it has. Well, you might want to say, well, aren't you overreaching a little bit? But at the same time, they're talking about a very real problem, a very real thing. How do we have a nurturing environment versus a depriving environment? And how do we make sense of the individual that is raised outside of that nurturing environment? Because what's happening to infants, or what does happen to infants has a very, very large part of who we start to develop into as individuals. But on top of infant development, we also have this social development that's taking place where we develop attachments to our family, we develop attachments to the mother. The sort of influence upon the mother and development, I'm sure all of us who have heard anything from pop psychology is going to be familiar with, the importance of mothering on the sort of psychosocial development of a child. Much more so than like when we're talking about popular conceptualizations, the impact of the father. It's the mother who is, at least in this sort of popular configuration, is responsible for the psychosocial development of the child. Developing its first attachment to the mother first, and then the father afterwards. But on top of that, our textbook also discusses the importance of parental development, and the variant parenting styles that a parent might have on their kid, be that too strict or too loose. In some ways, the way our parents interact with us set up the repeating framework for which we might interact with the world henceforth. So as we develop from infant to adult, basically, we start to have set out for us patterns of behavior that we then continually navigate and re-navigate as we move forward. And this also responds with a sort of cultural development, something that extends just beyond the way we interact within the family unit, but within the family unit within a cultural subset. So that, when we talk about a typical American family, there can be a difference between a typical white family, a typical black family, a typical, Asian family, or typical Hispanic family. And so, as much as anything can be typified, made typical, each of these differences can have different effects on the individuals raised within those cultures. And that's something always that we're not going to have the time to parse here, because when we talk about cultural difference, it's a much larger conversation than we have time for in this class, unfortunately, because not only is it interesting, but it's provocative in the way we actually start to assign not only how do we interpret these sorts of cultural differences, and then how do we evaluate these cultural differences, remains to be like a hugely interesting subject. For example, one of the things that continually happened when they had these sort of ethnographers that would go to different cultures and they would write about them, is that they would bring back all of these sorts of case studies after case studies, and this is the early 20th century, hundreds of case studies of all these different places and peoples, and what they found was that like the framework for understanding them right and wrong, good and bad, power structure, etc., always came from this sort of like super limited mindset of kind of like what we call Western hegemony, that the democracy is right, etc., etc. And so people, these sort of ethnographers were constantly implying or inferring their own value system as they're evaluating other cultures, and it made it virtually impossible for them to kind of set themselves up as true neutral, to actually start to evaluate what's going on in these cultures around them. And it created a sort of paradox that, wherever you went, there you were. So when we're talking about like studying cultural development in psychology, it becomes this sort of weird double-edged sword where you're looking at the right things because culture does matter, but oftentimes you can never separate yourself from your own presuppositions, or I hate to say never. You have a very difficult time separating yourselves from your own cultural presuppositions, so it makes the process entirely arduous and difficult, and fraught with intellectual peril, which is cool, actually. One of the other things, the third type of development to talk about other than infant and social, is linguistic development. And I know we brought this up before, but the development of personhood is intrinsic to the development of language. I think I quoted Thomas Mann before saying, speech is civilization itself. By that meaning that, who we are as a person comes from our ability to iterate what personhood means and what personhood is. So we conceptualize these things abstractly, and this is something that a lot of psychologists start to hit on. And when we talk about Piaget, this is what he's hitting on, is that our ability to conceptualize things at an abstract level and then start to manipulate those conceptualizations at an abstract level is the defining characteristic of a developed brain. And so when we're stuck with the limited resources for communication, the inability to describe things, we are actually limiting ourselves, or dare we even say like less functional in a psychological or developmental sense than those who have that sort of linguistic capacity. It's almost like painting with black and white, because you have not yet discovered colors. And this is what language does. Language is coloring. It's providing the means of accentuating and developing and then beatifying. But our development from language, and we can't, right? This is another topic that has been thoroughly discussed quite a bit. Noam Chomsky, ultimately said this is the hallmark feature of humanity, is language, and he is not the first nor the last to say that. But we start babbling, at 7 months. And then at 12 months, we're able to start to respond to single words. And at 18 months, we're starting to grow this sort of limited vocabulary. But then by the time we hit 2 years old, we start to have this sort of linguistic explosion, whereby we start to produce and assimilate whole sentences all at once. This is the large leap. It's a large leap to go from just babbling words and being able to say this, that, yes, no, to be able to craft whole sentences, even as they're not always obviously the best structured or most formulated, but we're able to start to actually communicate ideas after this sort of 18-month period. But we do find that as we continually develop our linguistic skills, it does help with the development of other neurocognitive skills as well. That's why there's this fad of making sure your kids know multiple languages early on. I say it as a fad, but it's actually one of those, yes, it's actually a really good thing to do. you are benefiting your child in a significant way when this takes place. But linguistic development remains crucial to our development into adulthood. So I mentioned Piaget a couple times, and essentially he's one of the early theorists of cognitive development. And basically he said that we had these different age groups, and during these age groups we transition from one to another in this sort of like, you go from one stage and then you kind of muddle around in that stage for a bit, and then finally you are able to transcend to the next stage in a sort of like punctuated equilibrium where you're remaining normal, and then you shoot up, normal, shoot up. And this is how he kind of describes the way in which we gain the ability for like psychological personhood, or this final stage, formal operational stage of what we call self-reflection. We start off in this sort of sensory motor stage, and that's where we're learning how to walk, we're learning how to feel, we're learning how to smell, we're learning how to touch, and all these sorts of just physical operations are taking place, and the brain is all the while starting to assimilate and adapt and assimilate and adapt, and it's starting to learn things, but we're still at such an early unrefined age that it's still just all developmental. But between the ages of 2 and 7, we can start to ask for things. We can start to talk. We can. We're at this what he calls a pre-operational stage. We can develop mental ideas of like food, give food, but we cannot manipulate these ideas. And again, when we talk about in an introduction to psychology class, the use of terminology is very important. When we say we want to manipulate ideas, manipulation does not carry a sort of stigma. But just like I want to be able to manipulate the buttons on a keyboard to type a paper, we're not manipulating it in some sort of nefarious way. We want to act with these things, act in concert with. But we move from this sort of pre-operational stage to what he calls the concrete operational stage. And this is where we can start to actually manipulate our ideas. The example the book gives is being able to reverse things. What did you do today? Oh, well, blah, blah, blah. You go through your day. Well, tell it to me backwards. Now you have to reverse the ideas themselves and go anti-chronological. And that sort of like mental functions is the type of thing that it takes a more developed brain to participate in. So it's kind of the idea of not just being able to instantaneously express a thought, but to express a thought and express variations of a thought. To start to be able to manipulate, which is kind of stepping outside that momentary impulse and asking the questions of how, when, where, and why. And by the time, Piaget says we're, in our basically tweens, we've hit a formal operational stage where we are now capable of this sort of self-reflection necessary to proceed to sort of like adulthood. Pretty young age, but then again, this is the age where we have held people as young as their teenage years accountable for their own behavior in a penal system. But we start to see people, at this age are able to hold themselves accountable, and we start to hold people accountable. We start to say it's not just you're a kid, but you're actually a young adult starting to function. And functioning in such a way that you might be punished for your behavior because you should know better through things like self-reflection. But his theories are very, very important in this sort of like establishing a norm of not only stages, but of stages of cognitive development where we actually can still use maybe not this timeline itself, but the sort of framework that he's setting up. This sort of cognitive maturation that he's setting up. Another theory comes from Erik Erikson, who kind of outlines this sort of psychosocial dilemmas or crises. And it's through these crises that we develop as a person. And each stage of life is kind of bent on this sort of question. Like the early stage, the earliest of early stages is trust and distrust. Will you be a person that's governed by trust through a nurturing environment, or distrust or mistrust through a non-nurturing environment? And then we start to talk about shame and doubt, and Erik Erikson is channeling a little bit of these Freudian ideas of shame and guilt that come at our early ages when we're starting to develop our sense of personhood. And that's always an interesting twist. How do we interpret doubt and guilt? Because so much of this, these early and mid 20th century psychologists are trying to account for this very real part of human experience. And they're looking for psychological reasons because they're psychologists. Maybe, and other people would argue and say, well, if you want to understand human guilt, maybe we need to look at sociological reasons, religious reasons. But the psychologists are trying to, find psychological reasons, i.e., developmental reasons that explain the predominance of guilt and shame in our day-to-day experience. But without diving too much into all of that, you can see there's multiple stages, and a lot of this makes a lot of sense. In our early childhood, 6 to 12, we're starting to develop our sense of industry. How hard are we going to work as a kid? And inferiority. How are we going to measure up to our peers? Because we're now in a classroom setting, and they put the dunce cap on the dumb kids, and they give gold stars to the good kids, and now we can start to sense what type of child we might be. And in our adolescence, we're defining our identity. In our adulthood, we're starting to define our intimacy, starting families and finding a partner. And then we get to our middle adulthood. We're beginning careers and fighting stagnation or generativity, where we're creating. And that takes us all the way to our late adulthood, where are we looking back on a life completed, or are we looking back at a life with despair? But the ideas that he's setting about these sort of dilemmas are important for defining who we are as a person. And it's our ability to progress through each of these psychosocial dilemmas that takes us on to the next one for Erik Erikson. So we're running a little low on time, but I want to wrap up some of these things. When we think about the adult life, because we've spent a little bit of time talking about our infancy, and we are going to come back and talk about puberty, because that's obviously a hugely important topic for psychological development in the later weeks. But when we also think about not only infant development but adult development, this is when we're starting to wrestle with health issues, the things we can control, the things we cannot control, the things like careers. And I would love to have another hour to sit down and talk about a theory of labor, Marx's conceptualization of the importance of work, because work becomes such an important part of our lives. And we may say to ourselves, well, I hate jobs, I hate having to do work, and that's reasonable, and that's true in many ways. Or many things that are very, very frustrating about having to work, but also as a functioning of who we are as people, labor and our ability to produce something of meaning defines us. And so I just remember that the show The Office, in the finale, where Jim is talking about how he owes everything to this stupid job, the life he has built, the family that he has, and there was no point in which he was like, oh yeah, this is the best job ever and I love working here. But it's our ability to take the things that we do and transform them into something more that kind of makes life worth living. And it's an important thing to think about when we're thinking about what our jobs are, what careers we're going to take, and do we hate everything that we're doing in the morning when we wake up, or do we celebrate that maybe even life when it's not ideal is something that's interesting and cool. But also, as adults, we think about marriage and generating our own family and starting that whole process all over again for another person, another little bit of you, and that sort of biological imperative to reproduce. And then hopefully we're all familiar with a little bit at least about this concept of the midlife crisis. But more important than the midlife crisis is perhaps for many of you guys the quarter life crisis, which is kind of this sort of transitional period, especially in our young 20s, where people are starting to look around and say, what am I doing with myself? What am I doing with this life? We've now gone through a series of schooling. We've now gone through high school and developed one set of friends, another set of friends. Probably had our first romantic liaisons, fallen in love, fallen out of love, maybe a couple times by now. Starting trying to make sense of it all. But these sort of intellectual crises where we want to make sense of our world around us and how difficult that can be. But ultimately, and this is where our chapter concludes in looking at human development, is on the conclusion of our human development. Parla Gavas was a Swedish writer who described that as the eternal smile. But when we think about death, while there is so much to say on the subject, psychologically speaking, one of the tried and true formulations of how we experience that go through the 5 stages of dying, which for anyone that has not heard this before is denial. That initial period where no, this can't be happening, even though we all at some level can intellectually assent to the idea that death is universal. We have the sort of initial response of not me, not now. This is not reality for me now. But from that anger and how unfair this might be, and bargaining, we will do anything to avoid this sort of eventuality. And then depression, this sort of overwhelming malaise that can take hold when faced with that eventuality of death. And then ideally you move to a place of acceptance. But when we start to think about this, this is not only a response that an individual might take to their own demise, their own ending, but the responses that we have to the endings of our loved ones, of those that are close to us, and the steps that we might go through to try to reconcile existence with non-existence. And this gets a little philosophical here, but this is one of the great challenges that a psychologist or anyone that a human will face, is when we're trying to reconcile existence. What does it mean to be here now in the present moment, to live with non-existence, to not be here, to be here a moment, then gone the next, and the sort of distress that causes us, because it admittedly should cause us great distress when we think about how difficult of a thing that is to reconcile existence with non-existence. What a horribly grim place to end a lecture on. But when we are talking about human development, that is the ultimate conclusion. So make sure we're getting our work done. The quizzes, assignments, and discussion boards. Have a great week, and I will catch you next time.